Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Self Made Dad. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my thoughts on raising a boy to be a man. And this came up for me because my son is about to turn one, and I was reflecting on him turning one, what that meant, and my experience being a father to him. And I remembered that when my daughter was born 6 years ago, I had this thought of, oh man, like I have to be a good example of a man to her so that she has good examples of manhood in her life to integrate healthily. With my son, the thought that came to mind for me was I need to raise him to be a man, which as I've gotten older, it's become a question of, am I a good enough man for my son to watch and grow up to be like? And that's a much more difficult question because what is a man? What is a good man? I don't know. I mean, I do know. It's actually been the focus of study for me for the last 3 or 4 months. Been reading books, having discussions with other people, finding opportunities to be challenged around my idea of what a man is and what a good man is. And going on that journey of research, I've discovered that there are all kinds of perspectives on what it is to be a man. I've found all these parenting blogs and people with perspectives. And one consistent thread that I've seen on the interwebs is that people get up in arms about what it means to be a man, right? You need to raise men. Men are under attack. We are having a crisis of manhood. And all of these terms that imply the importance of and existence of a definition of man. I've been grappling with the question of what is a man? If I'm going to raise this boy to be a man, I want to have a clear perspective on what that means. And, one of the questions that I got asked during this journey that stuck with me is what positive traits of what you conceive to be a man would you not want your daughter to have? Now, I have a 6-year-old daughter. She's awesome. And when she was born, I remember having to make these little decisions moment by moment that I wouldn't treat her differently or coddle her just because she's a girl. I didn't want to be less direct with her because she's a girl. I didn't want to be softer with the truth or manipulative of the truth because she was a girl. I didn't want to, encourage certain behaviors just because I associated those behaviors with being a girl. And it really forced me to consider what is it about her biological gender of being a girl that made me have these reactions, these biases. Every time I would run into a situation where like she would skin her knee, in my mind, my initial reaction would be, oh, pick her up, coddle her. She shouldn't be hurt. She shouldn't be, crying. She's fragile. Then I asked myself, like, how would I treat her if she was a boy? And I was like, I'd tell her to like get up and rub some dirt on it. So I started doing that. Whenever she asks me hard questions, I don't sugarcoat the truth. I don't try to paint fairy dust over it. I tell her, hey, this is why I'm upset with you, or this is what happened here, or this is a situation that causes these kind of outcomes. And I'm very straight with her. I think about that's how I would treat my son if he asked me those kind of questions. And guess what? My daughter is still a little feminine, girly princess, even though I raise her to be tough, assertive, all things that you would typically associate with being a man. So that question of like, what positive traits of a man would I not want my daughter to have really framed it in a way that made it challenging for me. And so I've continued to explore like what it means to be a man, what it means to raise a boy to be a man. The thing that I've come to conclude is that those people with all those opinions on the internet that are like, we are under assault as men and, toxic masculinity. I raise you toxic femininity. It's really caused me to question why those people feel so strong about it. I believe fundamentally that those people are used to a certain amount of privilege in their life where because they were born a man, because they exist as a man, they have a certain amount of privilege to get jobs, have an expectation of being treated a certain way, naturally or just actually not naturally, but like systemically are given opportunities or respect or power in ways that they didn't really have to earn. And as a Black man, my experience with people who are privileged, I tend to find that because they don't have the resistance of having to fight for the thing, having to earn the thing, having to build themselves up to qualify for the thing, they tend to suck at the thing. In this instance, I find that those men who are vocal and very emotional about the definition of man needing to stick to a very rigid, like back in my day type of perspective are people who are holding on to a thing that they know they aren't qualified for. I find that like the men and people I like hanging out with are people who believe in the model of earning the authority that you have, of earning the power that you have, of earning the role that you have. Because, I mean, that's how I was raised. That's how I got socialized into the world. And frankly, the people who hold authority and leadership and strength and power in the world that I respect and vibe with have all had some level of, I need to earn my way into this mentality. I think first, to understand why being a man matters so damn much, we have to remember that there are a lot of people who are used to having the privilege of being a man and everything that's associated with it, and then recognize that as the world moves closer and closer to equality, right, women getting bigger jobs, having closer to the same income, like just the type of work we're able to do can be done by a man or a woman. They're starting to feel that privilege slip, and equality feels like oppression to people who had privilege. So they're acting out, feeling like victims. They're seeing threat in places that, maybe at a surface level seems like they're under threat, but when you dig underneath it, it's really that they're not used to competing for the thing that they're used to getting. And so why do I focus on this, right? Why do I care that the market at large, the ideological world at large thinks of manhood from a place of privilege and power and entitlement? Well, it's because when I think about raising my son, I first think about how I have been teaching my kids in equal parts at their age to fight for and earn the things that they get in life. Nothing's going to be given to you. So to focus on manhood from a perspective of you are entitled to be in charge, run this thing, to have a say, to take your pick, it's unrealistic. And frankly, it's not in line with my values, right? So I think that's number one is I want to focus less on my boy growing up as this like rigid definition of a man who is entitled to these things and more as a man who has to earn and demonstrate value in these things. So that's fundamentally it, right? Number one, my boy and any of the men in my daughter's life, so should she choose to have men in her life, will not be men that are entitled to privilege just by the nature of them being men. That's like full stop, number one. But number two, then getting to the question of like, am I the kind of man that I would want my son to grow up to be? Like that begs a whole other question. That was a hard one to evaluate because I was like, all right, well, what makes me a man, right? And I heard recently another man say to me, he was like, the definition of a man can shift based on even the subcontext of the social interaction and environment that they're in. That means there are some people who love NASCAR and place a high amount of value on a person who knows and is really into NASCAR. That's not me. So like, I may be like, I don't really know cars that well. And the person who is in that environment may say, well, you're not really much of a man if you don't know cars. So there are like sub definitions of manhood, which tells me there ultimately really isn't a consistent definition of manhood. It's a social construct that we've made up. Like, let's not get into like, oh, biological man, biological woman. People are born, men or women, but there are also people that are born in the wrong bodies, frankly. There are 8 billion people in the world. You have to assume that some people were just like born wrong. It happens. It exists. I know and have people in my family who have been. I accept that. But in this context, we're talking more about a social construct of manhood that, if I'm going to hold a crown over my son's head, I want to be clear on what I'm expecting him to grow into. When I think back to the question of what are the positive traits of a man that I wouldn't want my woman or my daughter to have, which I've asked a few people who are even in this chat. I see Kyle's in the chat, and I had a conversation with him about this during a men's weekend. We had this interesting discussion, and it really came down to like, when you think of a man, you think of strength, you think of force. And to a certain extent, when you think of women, you think of community, you think of diplomacy. I think that is more as much on a biological definition as it is on like a social construct definition. Because, like I think that I would want my daughter to grow up with a certain amount of strength, and I would want my son to grow up with a good amount of diplomacy. People have used the term diplomatic when they describe me. Frankly, because of my biracial background, I have grown up to be able to hold multiple perspectives in my head and align these and find middle ground with them and be able to talk to the common points. So I don't think that that's necessarily just it. But what I have come to appreciate is that, like, I just want to raise good people. I want my son, I want my boy to grow up to be a good man, because a man is a older boy, right? And like in that sense, and like a woman is an older girl. The principles that I'm expressing to them each are basically the same, right? I'm teaching my daughter that she needs to develop skills that are of value, that she needs to think about working in a team, that she needs to find good partnership in her romantic relationships when she gets there. She's 6, but that she should also be resilient, that she should be tough, that she should be hardworking, that she should be assertive, but also recognize when she needs to give a little. Those are the same things I'm going to teach my boy. Are we in a world where we live or die by the plow? No. Could we go back there? Possibly. I'm constantly worried about a huge earthquake or some massive EMP taking out the electrical grid, and then we have to go back to first principles and like live off the land. It's like a constant worry of mine. DM me, we can talk about it separately. But raising kids and saying that you should be this because you are a girl, because you are a boy, I don't see much difference in how I'm going to raise them. And candidly, like, I'll give credit to my wife. Like, I've had a lot of discussions with her about this, where she will challenge my perspective on how I'm interacting with my daughter and if I would do it differently if it were my son, and vice versa. And I think about it like this, right? If my daughter were to fall and scrape her knee, I would tell her to, as long as she didn't break her kneecap or something, I'd say, all right, breathe, let the pain pass, get up, keep going. If I saw my son crying, I would tell him it's okay to cry, breathe, let the pain pass, get going. Just because one's a boy and one's a girl doesn't change how I'm going to be a parent to them. And I think that that cuts across most things that we think about from socializing our kids. So, look, I would challenge anybody out there who is a parent to a son to tell me what it is about raising them to be a man that is so dramatically different from how you're going to raise a girl, that it is explicitly only for men. Look, like, and separate from biology, right? Like, when we have the sex conversation with our kids, the conversation that I'm going to have with my son is going to be different than I have with my daughter. Some of the decisions that my daughter is going to have to make over time in terms of prioritizing when she does things like pursue motherhood, if that's what she wants, is going to be different than how I discuss it with my son, because frankly, like, they just have different biological demands on their bodies than a woman. Like, well, like a boy has a different biological demands than a woman does. It's a fact. But if I'm going to ask them, hey, are you going out there to deliver value in the world? Are you serving your community? Are you being a good person? Have you called your mother? Like, these are all things I'm going to tell them both, right? Because like, you can say, oh, like, boys should take care of their mothers, but girls should too. You can say girls should take care of their fathers, but I expect my son to call me too. So what are we talking about? Like, I think that the dialogue has gotten out of hand. We have a lot of people losing privilege in their manhood and are now in a situation where they have to actually fight for the things that they used to be entitled to or feel entitled to. And they're struggling with that. Well, my kids are going to always grow up thinking that they need to earn it, that they need to demonstrate value at it. And if they don't have the value or the capacity or the competency, go learn that shit. Go find somebody to encourage you, right? And I think that's going to be really, 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 really key. Just really quickly, because I have some great folks in the chat here. I see that Syntax is sharing that her daughter has her grandson blow candles to help breathing to calm down. And I love that. That's representative of parenting that allows boys to feel emotion. I asked in a poll earlier this week, your father taught you that a man is blank. That was the question that I asked. You get all these great platitudes, right? People would say that they are a leader, that they are discerning of themselves and others, that they are a man of God. And just going back to my earlier framing, what of those are things you wouldn't want your daughter to be, right? But we tend to silo people and silo men into things like they are emotionless, they are stoic, they're unshakable under pressure, taking away from them emotional capacity. So I love the fact that your daughter is having your grandson learn how to manage their emotions, because at first acknowledges that they have them and then has them relax. That's dope. I see that Mark made a mention that gender roles are a biggie, especially in the US, which is interesting because, like, and we can unpack this maybe on Friday in the chat room. I have found, so my half my family's in the Philippines. We still have conversations about, like, oh, they're a boy, so this, they're a girl, so this. Sometimes my mom, like, gives my daughter different foods than she gives my son. By the way, my son is 1 and my daughter's 6, because the boy needs to have chicken and the girl doesn't necessarily need chicken. And it's funny because, like, I talk to my daughter and she wants to be strong. She wants to take kicking and punching class, i.e., jujitsu. And I tell her, look, like, if you want to do that, you got to get your body stronger. You can't do that off of bread muscles. You need to have egg muscles or chicken muscles. You need to have protein. That's just a scientific fact. Like, you can't build muscle without protein. So it's ridiculous to say that, like, boys should get this before girls. Now, if you said boys build muscle faster than girls, yeah, that's again a scientific fact. Like, cool. So we need to think about approaching strength training with our daughter differently than strength training with our son. Cool. But to say that, like, because they are gender, then they have to do this, in most cases, 90% of cases, is actually not really applicable when you think about it. It just comes from a perspective of patriarchal oppression. And look, man, because of the skin I'm in, I understand that oppressions because of how you were born sucks. I'm not raising my son to expect people to submit to him just because he was born a certain way. Similarly, I'm not expecting my daughter to submit to anybody just because she was born a certain way different from them. But every good leader has to learn how to be a follower. And, like, that's a principle they're both going to learn. And if you're in a marriage, right, like a traditional marriage with a man and a woman, you're submitting to each other. Like, my wife is just as much in charge as I am. So I don't necessarily expect, like, my daughter to go get married if she marries a man to then just, like, bow down to him. Like, and similarly, I don't expect my son to just be like, you are going to do everything that I tell you to do, and, like, I'm going to put my feet up and do nothing here. I think that looking at this from a perspective of, number one, patriarchal perspectives have defined the way men exist in this world. And now that those are under question, that they're under investigation, and we're finding that they're not really useful, men are freaking out because they're like, oh shit, I gotta work for this now. I'm not with that. What I am with is raising kids who go out into this world and recognize that everything that they get, they're going to have to work for. Everything that they get, they're going to have to demonstrate that they deserve. And guess what? Everything won't necessarily come to them, even if they do work for it. And they have to learn what that disappointment looks like and feels like. Other things I'm going to raise my kids to be, right? Like, you want them to be good leaders. That's a boy or a girl trait. You want them to care about other people and demonstrate good character. I want my boy to do that. I want my girl to do that. I want them to provide service to the community, right? Like, check on your elders, give food and resources to people without, right? That is something I expect of my boy and I expect of my girl. Listen, in the military, positions of leadership are earned, right? You get promoted based on your performance. It's not just given to you 90% of the time. Even great leaders like Gandhi went through massive amounts of suffering to be recognized as a leader. You know, even in my capoeira practice, right? The people who are considered mestres or masters aren't titled that. They're not like, oh, I'm a master now. The community looks at how they're moving and then says, you're a master. They treat them as such because they see how they move. They've earned it by the way that they've trained themselves and what they've demonstrated into the world. And that is the core principle from which I'm raising these kids. Everything else is like, look, you got this piping internally. We got to figure out, like, how you're going to prioritize life or situations because of that. You know, menopause is a real thing. Prostate cancer for men's a real thing. There are different conversations from that, but everything else that I'm socializing these kids to be is coming from a common core of principles that I think the world deserves. And I know this is very important to us, that we see any person that we want to interact with have, and we expect our kids to demonstrate. So that's it. That's my rant for today. I'm sorry for being a little late. You can tell I'm in a different place. We are traveling. We traveled with our 6-year-old and our 1-year-old for 6 hours cross country, and it was bananas. And I'm like, I'm tired, but I'm about this consistency life. And that's another principle that these kids are going to get, is you got to show up every day and move the ball 1% forward every single day. And that's what I'm doing today. I send you off with much love, and please, please, please make sure that you are doing everything that you can do to deserve to be the parent that your kids see you as, and that you are doing everything that you can to be the hero that you expect to be in your kids' eyes. Cheers.